Welcome to the Greener Way podcast, a show about people, planet, and purpose, and how investors and corporate leaders push forward in a complex world. Terence Jeyaretnam, thank you so much for joining us today at the Greener Way. Can you introduce yourself for the audience and explain where you are in the sustainability sphere?
Thank you, Rachel. It's a pleasure to be on your podcast. My name is Terence Jeyaretnam. I'm a partner at Ernst & Young, based in Melbourne in Australia, and I work in sustainability, have done so for about 30 years now. I guess my main focus areas are around corporate sustainability, particularly climate change, but also the ESG sphere of corporate sustainability. I also have a number of board roles, which all sort of theme around sustainability and sustainable development goals.
Terence, I feel like you and I have been having conversations around sustainability since I started publishing in 2011, back in the days when you were with NetBalance. Can you first of all, how did you get into providing consultancy services to corporates around the sustainability question, and how has the whole sphere changed, at least over the 10 years that you and I have known each other, looking through that whole span of a 30-year career?
So it's a really good question, Rachel. I think I sort of described this to someone I was mentoring last week to say it's one of these things that you pick, and over the time of your career, you end up starting to see that it's actually become quite an important issue, and it's a bit like perhaps doing cyber risk as a degree back in the late 80s or 90s. And not really being an issue up until maybe the last decade. And sustainability has been a bit the same. So I ended up coming into the space by doing the first course on environmental engineering offered in Australia. That was at UWA in Perth. And I graduated in 1993 when environmental engineering wasn't recognised by Engineers Australia as an engineering degree. So I ended up spending a fair bit of time with Engineers Australia helping set up the College of Environmental Engineering. So now I am a real engineer. But I guess starting back then, coming out of that degree, working in Perth, the focus was very much around getting approvals and permits for exploration and continued mining activities in Western Australia. And that's not where I wanted to focus. So when ERM, the company that I was with at the time, was opening an office in Melbourne, and by that time I was doing a fair bit of travel to the eastern states, starting to focus on environmental management and environmental reporting, corporate environmental reporting. I decided to move to Melbourne to help set up that office, and that was in 1998. And really, I guess over that sort of decade or so, the first decade in Melbourne prior to meeting you, it was very much around environmental reporting, transitioning slowly to sustainability, disclosure, and how corporates would measure their performance. In that sort of window, I also spent 3 years with a startup that was focused on social responsible investment. It was one of the early startups doing research to provide research into funds managers. And we set up a research questionnaire and started asking questions and didn't get any answers, and all of that sort of fun times. But by the time I think we met, it was very much transitioning into a more holistic sustainability sort of discussion for corporates.
So what's been the through line for you, Terence? Was it the environmental? Was it the engineering and finding solutions? Was it what was the genesis of all of this evolution that's now led you to where you are at EY?
So I think the thread through all of that has been around measurement of performance, and specifically starting with environment, but broadening out into social and climate spaces. It wasn't. I wasn't the greatest engineer at uni. I must admit, I was much more. My thesis was around the way to improve environmental impact statements. So it's very much a
Mm-hmm.
qualitative focus, and I guess I've always had that focus around how to measure and how to improve, and that's been the thread. And in the sort of early or late 2000s, around 2010, might have been earlier. I did some research. No, it was earlier. It was early 2000s. I did some research around how to improve corporate disclosure around these areas and published three reports, which really, I guess, got me started on sustainable reporting and assurance of sustainable reports.
It's so funny. You and I started from a similar sort of line, but from very different places. I remember the beginning genesis thought for me. I was working in London, and I went to one of the early press conferences for Carbon Disclosure Project. This would be around 2003, 2004, and coming back, and my editor saying, "Oh, look, we can have about 200 words because who really cares what pension funds think about carbon emissions of." At that point, FTSE 100 companies.
Yeah.
Which started me thinking about, well, if it's important to measure it, there must be something important going on in this externality.
Absolutely. And I think what people missed was the rate of change around us
Mm.
and how things were so rapidly changing and how this was going to be so important.
So, is that sort of the biggest signpost for you, Terence, as to how the practice of sustainability has evolved? The fact that the pace is now, let's be honest, it's frenetic. Or had there been other sort of considerations that both positive and negative that have impacted on this?
Yeah, it's quite. I sort of reflect back and I think, and we'll get on to this, but I sort of think my mind works in a systems way, and I think in terms of future systems. And I think about
Hmm.
20 years ago, I could tell that this was going to all explode, and that I just needed to keep doing what I was doing, even though I was getting pushback
Mm.
from clients and pushback from the market. And I think that because I think I look at sort of big macro trends, and I can sort of start to see where things are heading. As an example, and I always give this example, when I was growing, so I moved with my family to Australia when I was 15, and when I was growing up in Sri Lanka, we did not have a waste bin, not a garbage bin, not a recycling bin, not a food waste bin,
Mm.
and not a glass bin. And we're going to find a glass bin soon. And now we're filling these things every week. We're filling 240-litre
Hmm.
containers. And if you start to sort of look at that scale of waste just as one topic, and you think, well, you expand that by X million billion people, well, clearly this is a massive issue. And that's just one example. And that's just exploded from no waste bins to 3 waste bins in the span of
Hmm.
my relatively short lifetime.
It's three waste bins, as you say, four soon with the purple bin for glass. And then if, you're sort of part of the lentil belt here in Melbourne, there's the compost bin and maybe the worm farm in the back garden as well. It's the way that we manage these things is evolving quickly, isn't it?
Exactly. Exactly. And so, yeah, I did feel that this is definitely heading the wrong direction. And now, I
Mm.
start to think about other macro trends like the sort of health crisis that we have globally. And,
Mm.
that's also heading in the right direction. Every indicator is giving us a signal on that front. And we'll come back to where I sort of see these threads combining.
How do you help break this down for your clients, Terence? Because obviously, for me, part of the fun is that you can go from a very specific topic to a systems level discussion. But part of the challenge is, I suppose, if you're working in a corporate and it's your job to measure and monitor, it gets overwhelming very quickly. So, how do you break down some of these systems level challenges in ways that can become appreciable for your clients?
Yeah, it's a great question, Rachel. I think I've got the benefit of having spent the sort of time I have in consulting, of having seen and mostly even on the ground, uh, the various industries that we're working with. So I've been to mining sites, I've been to manufacturing sites, and been to, all sorts of different industrial sites and seen the operations. And I've also had the, I think, privilege of seeing what that then means to, what the operations mean to executives and managers who are operating these businesses. And you have to speak their language. You have to sort of, if you know the operation, if you know how it works, and what the critical elements of the operation are, and what the KPIs are for the business, you then start to connect the trends around climate and sustainability and the range of sustainability issues that are coming out as biodiversity into what matters to them. And if you're starting to talk at a very high level, it really doesn't mean much to them. But if you can connect back into what does that mean to you this year, what is that going to mean to you in the short to medium term from a business growth point of view or business risk point of view, it then, you then start to have cut through. And that's been, I guess, a bit of a art that I've learned over the years, and probably have some scars from that learning process. But it's those things that you sort of cultivate on how to speak to business and the different industries. And once they know that you know their industry, they partly trust you. And once you can connect the risks to their industry, then they fully sort of get it.
I find that breaking down process, it's useful from an interviewing perspective as well, from the journalistic perspective, sort of trying to take these things which are systemic risks and which people may only be responsible for a particular slice of, and then sort of reducing it down without being reductive.
And you really need to get into their shoes, right? You have to sort of start thinking, sitting there with an executive who runs as I did last week, a tram network in Victoria. And you've got to start to connect the risks into that business and what they must be thinking about day in, day out.
So, Terence, you don't just bring this sort of systems level consideration to just the job. There's also a couple of really interesting directorships that you and I have talked about through the years as well. Global Citizen, Fairtrade, Australia, New Zealand. How does that round out your particular professional practice by participating in some of these other initiatives?
Yeah, so Fairtrade and Global Citizen, there's one other that is quite relevant, which is Food Frontier. It's a board, it's an organization that's focused on alternative proteins. And the final one that I'm about to get onto, I'm just waiting for the process to finalize, is Amnesty International Australia. And all of those have climate change in the middle of those. So if you think about Fairtrade, Fairtrade is an organization in Australia that's looking to grow the market for Fairtrade products and help producers in our region in terms of fair trade cultivation. So that's and if you think about the impacts of climate change, that's quite profound when you think about PNG and Asia, where products come into Australia from. If you think about Global Citizen, it's looking at eradicating poverty. Now, climate and sustainability issues are intrinsically connected to their mission. Amnesty International, focused on social justice and human rights. And if you think about climate, it is only going to increase the amount of people movement and refugee movement across the world. And Food Frontier is really focused on alternative proteins. Obviously, the current system of industrial agriculture with just as much emissions as all of the world's transport sector is not going to help us meet our 2050 goal, and alternative proteins are key to it. And so looking at both plant-based but also lab-based proteins is crucial to that. So that's the thread. And I guess I find that working with those nonprofits means that I'm getting to understand the systemic sort of nature of some of the struggles that we're facing, bring some of the experiences from business to them, but also take back some of the things that I'm learning into business, some of the work that I'm doing.
How does that interplay play out? What considering with that you've been with Global Citizen and Fairtrade Australia, New Zealand for a few years, how has it enriched your practice with your clients?
Um, I don't know whether there's sort of particular examples of how it's enriched. So there's no specific examples, but I think understanding some of the concerns, for example, in our region, the Pacific. Now, the Pacific has become quite an important area of focus, particularly with geopolitical threats. And so
Hmm.
businesses that are working in the region or are sourcing from the region need to understand better some of the impacts in the Pacific. And so working with Fairtrade has meant that I I understand some of the issues that are happening day in, day out, or week in, week out for the farmers in some of the regions that we support.
Hmm.
And Global Citizen likewise is very focused on the region for Australia. So the Australian Global Citizen Board is focused on Australia, but also aid from Australia into the region. And so it is quite connected into understanding regional issues and how that shapes our thinking.
Are we at a position yet, Terence, where we can sort of adequately grok the joined up nature of the challenges between human rights, climate change, poverty eradication, the SDGs? I often reflect that, the first climate refugees that Australia has had to deal with has been its own citizens. Watching people being loaded onto military transport during the Black Summer of 2019, 2020, for example, or seeing people internally displaced as a result of floods. And I guess suppose a corollary to that is why don't we use the language that we would apply to refugees to the global south when we talk about extreme weather events here in Australia, like internally displaced people or, climate refugees, even?
Yeah, I, so I, it's a really tough question. Depends on who's uh, who's sort of being asked the question. I think if you ask the question of the general average person on the street, they probably see some issues, and there's lots of
Mm,
studies around climate anxiety and so on and so forth. Um, I think if you ask the politicians, they're getting lots of different views, and so they're probably trying to sort of see things from every perspective. If you ask, those that are working in the space and businesses that are focused on this, I think they do get some of this. But my concern is that we've probably left a lot of work to be done in this decade, and we're going to find, I think, pretty quickly, and I think we already are finding that the different countries that need to act don't have the ability financially to act, and really are calling for business and private sector to fund some of this. And so if you're in a position where you've got a lot of work to do and you don't have a lot of resources, there's going to be a crisis point, and geopolitical tensions alongside all of this is definitely not going to help. And the pandemic certainly has not helped in terms of keeping our attention on the issues. So whenever there's a sort of threat from the left side, um, you know,
mm,
you then drop everything and focus on that, and that delays the response even further. So one of my concerns, I think, is that I mentioned industrial agricultural emissions. So if you look at the food sector, and particularly the sort of you know red meat industry globally, for every kilo of human being, there's 2 kilos of domesticated animals that are being
mhm,
farmed for our consumption. And those emissions are, roughly around 20% of global emissions. And we haven't even started having a discussion about those emissions, right? We're just
mm,
at the very early stages in Australia and New Zealand. And if you look at even the last COP meeting, it was very peripheral. And if we've
mm,
that discussion so late, and
mm,
whilst other sectors might be transitioning, um, that that's to me, feels like it's left things a little bit late to transition that particular sector, as an example. And there's a number of other hard to abate sectors.
I think what's interesting there is the fact that you see increasing numbers of farmers who are actually asking to be included in these considerations because they want that certainty for their forward planning for the cycle of their farming production as well.
Absolutely.
So there's a real opportunity there to where government can backfill where private capital, where business demand is already there.
Yeah, no, I totally agree, and I think you can't do any of that until you start having a discussion about the transition of that sector, and we haven't really started to have that. I mean, there's been a few reports produced and so on, but it's very early days.
What gives you hope? We are in this critical decade. There's so many, big bad risks on the horizon. But is there action for you that gives you reason to hope?
I think working in the sustainability space, Rachel, you'd know this, you'd have to be an eternal optimist. And so I do look for threads of optimism, and I do a sort of a ESG markers sort of column on LinkedIn on a monthly basis. And I look for the top 10 sort of changes that we're seeing, both negative and positive. And I try and include some positive trends. One of the ones that I recall including in the last couple of months was that Amsterdam has set a 50% plant-based consumption for its city. 60, I think it's 60% by 2060 and 50% by 2050, if I'm not wrong. So I start to see some trends like that. I think the biggest sort of marker for me for Australia was the last federal election, and that sort of gave me hope that Australians got it, that climate's important, that integrity is important, and those issues really sort of brought the new government and the Teals into power, and looks like fingers crossed that those policies are here to stay now, given the amount of support that Australians have voiced. So those sort of indicators give me hope that the person on the street's getting it, and that things have to move. I just fear that movement might be slightly late, but let's hope that we can catch up.
Well, on that note, I think we'll leave it there. Terence Jeyaretnam, thank you so much for joining us today on The Greener Way.
Thanks, Rachel. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to the Greener Way podcast. If you liked today's show, remember to rate and review us on your podcast platform and make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss an episode. Any feedback? Contact us on podcast@fssustainability.com.au. I'm Rachel Allen-Backus.
The Greener Way podcast is a product of FS Sustainability, a show about people, the planet, and investing in our collective future. All information in this podcast is for education and entertainment purposes only. The Greener Way podcast gives listeners access to information and educational content provided by discussing numerous financial sustainable options and our featured guests. It is not intended as a substitute for professional, legal, or tax advice. The hosts of The Greener Way are not financial professionals and are not aware of your personal financial circumstances. FS Sustainability operates under an Australian Financial Service License and the exemption made available under the Corporations Act 2001 in respect to any information or advice given. Before making any financial decisions, you should read the product disclosure statement and, if necessary, consult a licensed financial professional. For more information, head to the disclaimer page on the FS Sustainability website, fssustainability.com.au.